Hey, good morning and welcome to today's conversation. This is going to be a particularly timely and important conversation on labor migration in the Western Hemisphere. Across the Americas, the demand for workers in key sectors from agriculture to construction to hospitality continues to grow. And at the same time, of course, we're witnessing unprecedented global mobility, with more people on the move today than any other time in recorded history. When managed effectively, this convergence of labor demand and human mobility presents a powerful opportunity. Immigration can play a vital role in addressing labor shortages and improving job market alignment. And it's a reality that policymakers are increasingly recognizing. We have programs like the H-2A and H-2B visas in the United States and the Canada-Guatemala temporary guest work program. These are concrete examples of efforts to connect employers with the workers they need while creating legal, regulated, and safe channels for migration. But while these initiatives show what's possible, there's still much work to be done. We need more pathways that are fair, transparent, and protective of workers' rights. We need policies that meet the needs of economies without leaving migrants vulnerable to abuse or exploitation. And we need regional cooperation and dialogue to scale and strengthen these efforts. Today, we're going to hear from leaders who are helping to shape more effective and humane labor migration systems across the Americas. I'm so grateful to have each of you with us today and for being part of this really vital conversation and for the work that all of you do every day. But now it's my pleasure to turn things over to our moderator, Eric Jacobstein. Eric is a senior fellow here at the Inter-American Dialogue and founder and principal at Puentes Global Advisory. Eric brings deep expertise on migration and labor issues after 2 decades of U.S. government experience at the highest level. In the executive branch, his most recent role was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. And he also played the role as senior advisor at the USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, and a founding staff director of USAID's Northern Triangle Task Force. On the Hill, his roles included senior advisor on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he led work on Western Hemisphere policy. And it's worth noting that from 2002 to 2006, when Eric was 12, he actually worked at the Dialogue. He has deep roots here with us, and we're so grateful to have Eric back as a senior advisor. And Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks for those terrific introductory remarks and for always ensuring that the Dialogue puts together such important and really timely programming. We have an outstanding group of panelists who I'll introduce shortly, but let me briefly provide some context on why we're holding this event today. Migration management policies, when carried out effectively by any country, including, of course, the United States, need to find that proper balance of border enforcement and lawful pathways. As history has shown, it's certainly not easy to get this formula just right. So it's of course critical to enforce borders and demonstrate that there are consequences for regular migration. But just as important as the stick is the carrot. And countries, in my view, are most effective when border enforcement is complemented with lawful migration pathways, including refugee admissions and parole programs, and of course our topic today, labor pathways. In 2011, immigration economist Michael Clemens, who many of you know, wrote a groundbreaking article entitled "$1 Trillion Bills on the Sidewalk." And the article basically posited that the restrictive migration policies put in place by governments around the world waste trillions of dollars given the large number of available workers in certain lower income countries and significant labor shortages in higher income countries. Again, governments, whether the US or any government, must enforce borders. But governments around the world can do significantly more to advance labor pathways that match available workers with sectors that have labor needs. And nowhere is this more true than here in the Western Hemisphere, where we see labor shortages not only in North America, in the US, Canada, and Mexico, but also in rapidly developing countries such as now oil-rich Guyana. So when it comes to the US, it's no secret that the Trump administration's approach to migration management over the past 100 days has been characterized by a disregard for vulnerable individuals who previously availed themselves of lawful protection pathways, including by attempting to eliminate TPS, temporary protected status for Venezuelans, and the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela parole program. At the same time, it does appear that space continues to exist for labor pathways, including, I believe, for the H-2A and H-2B visa programs, which permit agricultural, and unskilled non-agricultural workers to come to the US on temporary, seasonal basis and fill critical labor gaps. During the Biden administration, an increased allotment of H-2B visas by the Department of Homeland Security, specifically for Central America, was a priority in the successful efforts to reduce irregular migration from the subregion. And there was a critical role, of course, from USAID in serving as a matchmaker between labor ministries in the region and relevant US industries and companies. And we'll hear more about that from our panelists. But looking to the sort of the present day, in late March, the Trump administration allowed a supplemental tranche of H-2B visas to be released. This was welcome news, given indications in Project 2025 and elsewhere that the H-2A and H-2B visa programs might be eliminated. It also likely reflects an understanding of the economic importance of these programs. So I hope that today can be the first of many conversations and dialogue about how to increase and improve the H-2A and H-2B seasonal worker programs, including by putting in place more robust worker protections. But today we're not going to only focus on the US, but also more broadly examine what actions can be taken to better match labor shortages with workers throughout the Western Hemisphere, while ensuring respect for worker rights. So let me go ahead and introduce our terrific panel. Danny Bahar is a senior fellow and director of the migration program at the Center for Global Development. He's also a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute and a visiting associate professor of economics at Brown's Department of Economics. And he's affiliated with the Growth Lab at Harvard University, as well as a number of other international research networks. Next, Marcela Escobari serves as a senior fellow for global economy and development at the Brookings Institute. She previously was a coordinator for the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration Protection and special assistant to President Biden at the White House. Before that, she served as assistant administrator, leading the Latin America and Caribbean Bureau at USAID from 2022 to 2024, and also during the Obama administration. Marcela also is executive director at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. And last, but certainly not least, Rafael Rodriguez served as Minister of Labor and Social Welfare of Guatemala from 2020 to 2024, where he promoted international labor mobility, strengthened the General Labor Inspectorate, and advanced dignified employment initiatives. He also is Guatemala's representative to the governing body of the ILO, the International Labor Organization. Today, Rafael is an advisor to the Institute for the Recreation of Private Company Workers and the Superintendents of Banks. He's also the founder of Balam Hunters, a company specialized in international recruitment. So let me go ahead and start with some questions for our panelists and look forward to hearing from all of you, a few questions from the audience as well. So Danny, let me start with you. Let's start with the US labor market. Last May, you published an important study that looked at the link between Southwest US border crossings and labor market tightness over the previous 25 years. It found basically that increased border crossings align with greater job availability in the US, regardless of the political party in power. So given the restrictive climate on irregular migration, frankly, from both the Trump and Biden administrations, what opportunities exist to match US labor needs with workers from the Western Hemisphere who seek employment here? And let's also take a step back and hear from you about the current US labor needs that aren't being filled by US workers. I know you've spent a great deal of time mapping this. Over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and it's fantastic to be here at the Dialogue, one of my favorite places in DC and beyond. So, and thanks for putting this great panel together. So, I think I've been writing a bit more about this, and this is a good metaphor that I'm going to share with you that I've been putting together. The world as a whole, particularly rich countries, are going through what's going to be a huge earthquake. And there's kind of two tectonic plates moving underneath, beneath us that we haven't really realized. One of them is aging populations. In the US in particular, baby boomers are retiring. There's a much larger amount of people who thankfully are, we're living for longer, which is kind of a good thing, and it's a result of many decades of progress that has allowed us to get better medical attention, better health. So those are good news. On the other hand, we have this other tectonic plate, which is a shrinking working age population. People are having less kids. The ratio of like old to young people is increasing in the US, in Europe. Japan perhaps is the most extreme example of this, which that has been going on for a while. What we saw on 2022 and 2023 here in the US of like 2 million people crossing the border every year, which was unprecedented. And it was part of this whole atmosphere and the political scene that I think a lot of people, rightly so, I would say, attribute what a lot of Americans felt as chaos to the success of Donald Trump in getting back to the White House. To me, that was a symptom of this soon to be huge earthquake. The US, this became very obvious to everybody walking around the streets during COVID-19. The US has been having huge shortages of labor across cities, across occupations. We always think about nurses and health aides who can help people people who are getting older. We always think about we started seeing things as truck drivers. If you remember during COVID, we saw people in fast food restaurants. There was just they were all over McDonald's and Burger Kings. There were like help wanted signs. We saw people we were missing people in the hotel industry. So it was really wide, and not to high skilled workers too. Like I think about 20 to 25% of all software engineers in the US are foreign born, which also hints to kind of these dynamics that there's just not enough people in the US to fill this job. So what we saw during those years, 2022 and 2023, and that's what I'm showing in this paper that you mentioned from May, is that this huge inflow of people really aligns almost one-to-one, not perfectly, but in very high numbers, with the number of jobs available in the US. Meaning people are coming because there are job opportunities. That should be a good thing for the US, because otherwise this will create stagnation. It will really stop a lot of industries from growing further. And what we perceive as chaos was not really a border crisis, but it is. They come through the window. And that's exactly what happened. And I know that Marcela at the White House, working with a lot of policymakers around the region, were really thinking about this by trying to design labor pathways so that actually people can come through the door in a regular way. Because that's what the times of today call. We need a new migration system that takes into account the needs of the American people, meaning the labor shortages. How can these migration flows can help us fulfill and that are critical for the future economic growth of the country. And I'll stop there by saying that, just mentioning the second part of your question, that this is a project we're engaging. We're really trying to quantify these needs for migration by city, by occupation, so that it can actually serve to policymakers, and starting with local authorities in a way that is relatable to people in Congress. How many nurses are going to be needed over the next 10 years in Akron, Ohio? or San Francisco, or any city, any big city from North Dakota to Texas. And we hope that this will be a conversation started to really think about migration, take it away from the political sphere. This is not about pity. And this is also not about prioritizing security versus as a trade-off against pity. This is about how can we use these flows that are going to continue to happen because this earthquake is about to get much worse in a way that is sustainable, in a way that is beneficial to the U.S. economy.
Great. Thank you so much. Marcela, I want to ask you a couple of questions, but let me start here. In your roles leading the USAID Bureau in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also the White House as special coordinator on the Los Angeles Declaration, as Danny mentioned, you successfully focused on matching labor shortages in the Western Hemisphere with available workers. So not just looking at the US market, but looking at countries, again, like Mexico or Guyana that were in need of additional workers. Can you tell us about this work, but also about the broader opportunities that exist really throughout the Americas to enhance labor pathways?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Rebecca, and the Inter-American Dialogue for always creating these spaces at the right time to discuss important topics. Look, every policy has a trade-off, and we probably don't speak about it enough. And many of the trade-offs with migration have to do with temporal effects, right? The costs are now, and the benefits are tomorrow. But when it comes to temporary labor migration, particularly well-regulated, and by that we mean that it's focused on occupations that are hard to fill with American workers, and that the wages are equivalent, so it doesn't reduce wages for American workers, you really get the benefits of migrants can bring to our economy with less of the costs. And the H-2 visas were exactly that, right? Trying to target and fill labor shortages that are demand-driven. The employers decide how many workers they want to hire. And to be honest, they have to be quite motivated because the process is still quite onerous. So if we do enter a recession, as Danny explained, we hire less. So what we tried to do at USAID, with the help of USAID, but it really was an interagency effort, was to diversify temporary labor pathways, which over 90% were coming from Mexico, to increase the number coming from Central America, which accounted for a large percentage of irregular border encounters. So we helped build the capacity from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to find willing and capable workers, to verify their credentials, to facilitate this matching, and actively support these workers during their time in the US to be successful at their jobs and to return back to their families and communities and use the skills that they learned. I know Rafael will talk about this, but as a result of this work, in Central America, the number of temporary workers had tripled from around 10,000 in 2021 to 30,000 in 2024. But as you said, as I engage with countries throughout the region, mostly under the banner of the Los Angeles Declaration for Migration and Protection, I increasingly heard from other countries about their labor needs. And the truth, as Danny said, is that the demographic changes in the US, with the baby boomers retiring, a declining native-born working-age population since 2016, is not a uniquely American challenge. From the EU to Japan to Mexico, these demographic changes are affecting a growing number of countries. So the moment really demands ambitious proposals that go beyond the increasingly outdated concept of sending and receiving countries. Both advanced and developing economies have significant labor needs and could all benefit from a market that matches worker skills with labor shortages. And it was in this spirit that we launched Labor Neighbors, to create some standardization of skills taxonomy and visa regimes. And the idea was of Labor Neighbors is to create a regionally and ultimately a global marketplace for talent to match labor needs and worker skills. Canada and Mexico have temporary labor programs in place that they expanded as part of our hemispheric partners' shared commitments to reduce irregular migration under the LA Declaration. We saw countries like Belize announce new labor visa programs. Guyana, like you mentioned, with their oil boom, has and will have huge labor needs in natural resources, hospitality, and many other sectors. So we were discussing with them ways to build out their labor visa regime in the last months of the administration. But even further away, Italy had expanded its temporary work visas to 450,000 in 3 years. Spain had done this too and was a very proactive partner. So bottom line, at a time of huge displacement in the Americas, partly because of the forces that Danny explained and our labor market, but also other crises, including authoritarian governments in Venezuela and elsewhere, it meant that being able to match that displacement with labor needs across the globe was really an opportunity. And ultimately, being able to build that and continue that will disintermediate the criminal networks that now do this work at a huge cost to migrants, but also our institutions.
Great, thank you. Marcelo, just to quickly follow up, these make a lot of sense, and yet we're currently in an atmosphere here in the United States and globally, really, of deep scrutiny of these programs. So what does the theory and the practice say about their actual impact?
So the literature has a lot of evidence around the aggregate benefits of these programs, which doesn't mean that there are not abuses or individuals that get displaced. But let me give you just a few of them, right? Number one, it reduces illegal migration. Research shows that 34% of Mexican migrants coming to the U.S. on lawful work would otherwise come irregularly. And we had a study at USAID specifically around H-2 visas, that in communities where the H-2 visas existed, people migrated illegally at substantially lower rates, at 10% compared to 30% in nearby communities that didn't have availability of these visas. So it meant that just having them available meant that people waited for their turn. It creates jobs for Americans, and there's great studies about that, companies, particularly small and rural companies that have access to H-2B visas, hire 12% more U.S. workers. It also creates economic mobility for U.S. workers, right? We do talk a lot about migrants, that these are jobs that Americans won't do. It's not always true. A few Americans may take some of these jobs in meat packing plants or picking fruit, but the fact that migrants do these jobs means that native-born Americans can get better jobs, usually customer-facing or managerial jobs. And lastly, it kind of helps migrants, right? The Guatemalan in an H-2B in the forestry sector can make 13 times more than what they would make at home. So it is life-changing, and they go back to their communities and can use those abilities and send their kids to school and invest in their communities. And to conclude, Eric, you probably saw this in action too, but having seen this, these people who receive these H-2 visas, it sticks with you. People are very proud to be able to migrate in conditions of dignity, to not be treated like criminals, to be valued for their work. And maybe we don't talk about this enough, but to be able to go back to their families and be part of their children's lives. Like, there is a real human part of these stories that I think we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you very much, Marcelo. And I think that's a good segue to Rafael. Rafael, as the Minister of Labor in Guatemala, many of us worked very closely with you in your leadership role in these precise issues from 2020 to 2024. You were clearly a regional leader in pushing for the increased uptake of U.S. temporary work visas for Central Americans, and namely, again, the H-2A and H-2B visas, which, when done right with strong labor protections, are really, as Marcelo described, a win-win-win, a triple win, in that they curb irregular migration, they fill labor gaps, and they bring resources back to communities throughout Central America and beyond. And probably on top of that is what Marcelo mentioned, is that they keep families together that otherwise wouldn't be. So tell us about your work with the Labor Ministry and also the challenges that still exist to bring these worker visa programs to scale?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here in the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you, Rebecca and Eric, and nice to see you again, Marcela. Danny, I haven't the pleasure to meet you before, but it's a pleasure to be with you here now. For me, it means a lot to speak about the program that we built with so much energy from scratch, involving both governments, the US, the Guatemalan government, and the other governments from the region, teams from the ministries of labor, of foreign affairs, USAID, the State Department, Eric's team, Marcela's team, US employers, recruiters, and 1,000 of workers across the region. In Guatemala, that is one of the things I want to talk to you about. When we started in 2020, the program was sending just about 20 people to Canada per year. By 2023, over 4,500 people were working and placing that year alone in the US. And that sums to the other countries that were sending people. So more than 8,000 people in total between 2020 and 2023 went to the program by the ministry, run by the ministry. That doesn't mean that there were private recruiters that were doing their job also and matched the numbers that Marcela gave us. And so it wasn't a one-time spike, it grew steadily year after year. So that means that the exponential growth is a proof that the governments, employers, and partners work together. Regular, safe, and family-friendly migration becomes possible, and it's scalable. And that's one thing I want to point. Some might say these numbers are small compared to the estimated more than 300,000 Guatemalans who migrated irregularly to the US in 2023, according to a recent paper published by the ALO and ACTEMP organization and written by Jorge Benavides from Fundesa. But I believe these figures, what really show is the potential of a legal pathway that benefits both the US needs of labor and our country's need for jobs. We've shown this can be a short-term solution. Building jobs in Guatemala takes time and resources, while in the US, new jobs are being created faster than people are willing to take them, as Danny said. So according to this ILO study, in the next decade, for example, Guatemala will have 2 million more people working age. Contrastly with the OCDE countries. Even if labor participation rates stay the same, we will need more than 125,000 jobs, new jobs every year. But we are currently in Guatemala creating just over 88,000 annually. So in our best years from 2020 to now. So the gap explains why over 70% of our workforce is in the informal economy. And this is not just a Guatemalan issue, it's common across Latin America, which is why temporary and formal work opportunities in the US are fast, dignified bridge for many families. And that's a point of view which we have to see this problem from the human part. From the US side, the way to meet labor needs difficult staff to staff sectors, not just seasonal ones. For example, Danny mentioned McDonald's, but that's not a seasonal work. We need to enhance the program in order to bring not only seasonal workers, but workers for all those kind of jobs that are not being occupied by American people. And so everyone wins. I support the idea that across the potential spectrum, both Republicans and Democrats now know that employers need workers. I think the actual administrator himself said that legal migration should be maintained. And despite the political change in Washington, it's very happy for me to say that Guatemalan legal temporary workers from these programs and our company keep being hired in the US in 2025. So the program stayed, and we keep sending workers to the US. We did achieve something important when we worked together. We built institutional capacity in the labor ministry in Guatemala. We went from 8-person program team to a 50-person program team. We cut processing from 50 to 15 days, And all of this was with help and with the support of USAID. So has to be said. But you did the job, and you help us build these capacities inside the Guatemalan institutions. Today, I must disclose, I am co-founded a private recruitment firm, Balam Hunters, with 2 partners. From this perspective, I firmly believe, if you ask me, one of the questions was what's going to be happened. I believe that the ministry should now turn and act primarily as a regulator and a supervisor. The Ministry of Labor in Guatemala was acting too as a recruiter because we had to know how to do things, but now we know. And it has to become a regulator and supervisor in order to oversee that labor rights are being supervised. And I come today to remark that I'm grateful. Someone who worked with USAID and for USAID in the past, I can say the work we did, as Marcela said, changed lives, really changed lives. We help Guatemalan workers and American employers connect, build trust, and meet their needs. And if I hadn't said this before, let me say now, and Eric too, thank you. To make this program even more successful, and with this I want to finish this part of my remarks, there are 5 key actions I will propose. First is keep increasing the number of H-2B visas. Demand far exceeds supply. Secondly, streamline the process. We did a lot in order to streamline the process when it started, especially for 2 H-2B visas, which take up nowadays up to 95 days and involve a lottery. That has to change in order to make this program work better. And keep investing in countries of origin to strengthen ethical, fast recruitment capacity, as you did. Promote fair competition while enforcing ethical standards and protecting workers' rights. And lastly, I hope that the program could be expanded to more sectors that aren't seasonal but still face work shortages. And to finalize this part of my participation, I will also like to add something more forward-looking. Everything we discussed works under predictable conditions, but the future of work is becoming increasingly unpredictable. With the rapid advances of AI and geopolitical changes in 2025, humanoid robots are no longer science fiction. They are becoming near-term reality. Smart factories are already here. What if the US brings factories back to its territory? That is what is the government saying. Ironically, the only perspective that gives me hope came from a CEO from an AI company. I don't remember which one. I follow all of them. And he said that AI will first replace the people who created it. It means programmers. But soon it will go through agriculture to all sectors. So we have to look forward to that also. And to conclude, we've said this many times when we were in the US with USA, with the Department of States, with DHS, with DOL, but more a regular migrant earns better, lives better, and is more productive. But most importantly, and I said this as a Guatemalan, I can tell you a regular migrant gets back home and gets a chance to hug their family every year. And that's the reason why they left in the first place. So thank you. And I see forward of having these conversations about H2B and H2BA programs.
Thank you. Those were great recommendations and really helpful. Maybe if I could just follow up as I start to get into some questions here with what you mentioned in terms of labor protections. Could you give us a little bit more detail in terms of what more can be done, Rafael, to enhance labor protections in temporary labor programs, in H2A, H2B, but otherwise? You obviously were on the front lines. You came to the United States. You visited with some of these workers. What can be done statutorily, or just even sort of by practice, by executive action, by this administration or future administration to improve labor conditions for individuals on these programs?
I think that the framework is there. The declaration is a framework. The paper is there saying how recruitment must be, how work must be done in the US. We have some agreements signed in the past governments. And now the thing comes to how to enforce these agreements in the territory. And that comes with the communication between governments. If the Guatemalan government gets notice that some of the contracts are not being complied with, then it has to come to the US authorities, labor authorities, in order for them to come to the places and see if they are complied with or not. And so it's more a thing now, I think, about building the communication and the streamline on how to make these declarations, how to make these agreements that we made in order to enforce labor rights to become a reality for the workers there. And for the workers not to be afraid of some retaliation if they denounce that they are not being treated well and that the contracts are not being complied, that they can all be back in the US if they come early from their work because they denounced some of the work was not doing, some of the work conditions were not being complied with. So that will be my first, and I think what we learned is having the channels to speak with the US governments locally and federally to make them know that some of the contracts are not being complied with.
Great, thank you. Marcela and Danny, let's talk about the current US political climate for a second. Do you think that the lack of due process that we've seen from the Trump administration will discourage workers who might otherwise seek labor pathways here from coming to the US and push them to Spain, Canada, or other markets in need of such labor? Or is the US market just so vast that it won't matter?
It's a good question. I think the US has had tremendous appeal, and some of that will not change. Some of the policies that we are seeing today are designed to instill fear and uncertainty in the migrant population, probably targeted to undocumented migrants. But when these policies under enforcement challenge the rule of law and due process, it is likely to make the US a less attractive destination for everyone, particularly the ones that have choice, like skilled workers or students who fuel, $50 billion, a $50 billion industry here in the US. We have already seen that some of this has discouraged international travel to the US. There's been an over 9% decrease at a time when we expected a 9% increase of tourism into the US. So I do think it is fair to worry that these policies will threaten the US comparative advantage as an innovation economy, right? Half of Harvard's PhDs are foreign born. Many stay and work in our labs. They find new cures. They invent new technologies. They teach our kids. I think like a quarter of post-secondary teachers are foreign born. So I do believe that the centers in Europe, Canada, and China are making aggressive plays to become a destination of choice for this talent pool, and they're smart to do so.
Danny, anything to add?
Great question. And we economists are terrible at prediction, especially the future. But I would say two things. I do think the forces are much stronger than what most politicians think they are. And you mentioned at the beginning one of the results of my paper, which I think speaks a little bit to this, which is that this pull factor that the American labor markets have been have stayed pretty much robust. It doesn't matter who was sitting in the White House for 25 years, starting from Bush, Obama, then Trump, then Biden, and I would say also Trump again. So I think that this pull factor that is pretty much absent from the conversation at the political level, I think, from my outsider point of view, it's very strong. And most of the focus has been always in the push factor, meaning let's deal with the root causes. Let's throw investment into Central America and beyond to keep people from coming. And people, guess what? They keep coming because this attraction is very strong. Now, of course, I think that there's some deterrence based on what's happening today. And maybe it's soon enough to see some data, but we have already some data of some things that happened in the first Trump administration when maybe, weirdly enough, we thought the rhetoric couldn't be more administration, a lot of the tax on some of these programs, the H-1B visas, for instance, they resulted in some rerouting of certain migrants to other places. And I think that these other places, you mentioned Canada, Europe, are taking notes. And I think that this is kind of an inflection point kind of in the world. Like the first movers tend to will get ahead. Those countries that realize how important migration can be will be the ones who are going to move ahead and use this to their advantage in terms of economic growth. And the countries who keep building walls will stay behind. And I think this is going to be kind of what is going to dictate growth for the next decades. And just to give you an example of this is there's this firm that I met the CEO once called Mob Squad in Canada. It's the perfect textbook example of what arbitrage is when you study economics 101. The paper you mentioned at the beginning of Michael Clemens, who, the title is very telling because economists saying there's no dollar bills on the floor, and Michael is saying there are $1 trillion bills lying on the sidewalk. What Mob Squad as a firm is doing is that they have been identifying skilled workers that were actually very close or even giving an offer from an American firm, let's say as software engineers, for instance, but they actually couldn't fulfill the job because of the visa restrictions, because the H-1B quotas are very small. So there's always much more demand than what actually the visas can give. I think we're talking about $65,000 visas a year, plus another 20,000 from like students, etc. Numbers are very small. They haven't been updated for 30 years. But what this Mob Squad, the firm, is doing is that they're identifying these people who have a job offer from the US, but they just cannot make it because they just don't have a visa, offering them a path to live in Canada, and then contract them out to the same firm that gave them the offer. So they're living in Canada, they are doing the same job remotely, and Mob Squad is actually taking a cut from that, making a profit. And this is exactly what arbitrage is. This is an opportunity for arbitrage of countries and or even private sector within countries. And I think we're going to see much more of this. And the more we see of this, I mean, the meaning is like other countries are taking advantage of these voids for their own economic benefit that otherwise could have gone to the US.
Terrific. Thank you. Rafael, go ahead and jump in.
Thank you. I think, and I want only to add that the pull factors, as Danny, and the push factors are still there. So what it means is if there is no other way, other legal pathway to go there, what probably is going to happen is that a cost is going to be increased by the coyotes because the people is needing to go, and the margin between what they're going to invest and what they're going to earn is still payable for the people who want to go to the US. And all the business around this illegal migration is still there. So they are going to find a way to make the people go into the US territory. So I think these kind of conversations and the administration keep going with the H2A and H2B program. It's a good sign and should be increased because it's a solution for the problem.
Great, thank you. Let me ask one more question, then I'll share some questions from the audience. But just wanted to ask, sort of getting out of the U.S. context, and maybe Danny, we can start with you. Where in the hemisphere outside of the U.S. Do you see the greatest potential for additional labor pathways? I know we talked a little bit with Marcel about North America, Guyana, otherwise. Where's there potential thinking outside of the U.S. context?
That's a great question. I'll just start with some kind of basic insights, but I'm sure others can chip in. Marcela mentioned Mexico. Mexico, I think, is kind of the quintessential example of how their demography has also changed, and we see that actually in the data. So this inflow of immigrants from Mexico to the U.S. that we saw, late last century, and maybe earlier this century, like the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, has kind of fully reversed. There's not as many immigrants coming. What we see coming from the Mexican border are immigrants from Central America. So this Mexico, it has passed the demographic stage, and also as a consequence of the economic growth, not as great as we expected, but some economic growth in Mexico, we are seeing much more opportunities there than actually people in certain occupations. So I think Mexico is a place that could really benefit from this flow. We did a little bit of work with the Inter-American Development Bank, looking at what opportunities Mexico has from people crossing the border, Central Americans and other people from the hemisphere crossing throughout Mexico to come to the U.S. But what opportunities Mexico would have if these people decided to stay, particularly in the south of Mexico, which is kind of the area of Mexico that is the most challenging one in terms of economic growth. And the data wasn't that great, so we didn't find a very straightforward way of thinking of this, but we do think that there's something interesting to keep looking into that. I think that there is very good opportunities for Mexico as a whole, but also to develop, to think about how these immigrants that are not going to find their way into the US, or it's going to be harder for them, how can they find their way into thinking into a development strategy for places like Chiapas, Oaxaca, the south of Mexico. So I think that that's a quintessential example.
Terrific. Marcela.
Let me add two quick things, Eric. There are a couple myths around migration. There are many myths around migration, but one of them, because obviously Mexico, I completely agree with Danny, is like low-hanging fruit, is the largest market. The dynamics are one where they could really take advantage of these changing flows. But the couple myths are, one is, if I'm a sending country, that I'm not receiving. And the truth is that that's no longer the case, and more so given the forces that Rafael talked about, where the needs of the markets are changing. We have a colleague that says knowledge travels faster in brains than into brains, right? So in these changes, structural changes in each country, every country is going to need some type of workers and is going to export other workers. We were talking to Jamaica because they wanted Spanish teachers in their rural schools. We were talking to Uruguay, who needed nurses, or very concrete skills that I think, again, this global matching could make a difference. And the other myth is that if I have unemployment, I don't need migrants. And that I've heard a lot from leaders. But the truth is, if you do it right, if you regulate it, and you provide legal status to migrants, these migrants can create jobs for your economy, even if they are in the informal sector. So there's some things that we just need to unlock for smarter and more pragmatic migration policies.
Great, thanks. Rafael, anything you want to add? Or I also have a couple H2B questions coming in. Oh, wait, okay.
I'll wait.
Great. Okay. Well, let me provide two questions from the audience that have to do with the H2B program that I think are particularly interesting. We'll start with you, Rafael. The first question is, the H2B visa program provides critical workers for employers and includes both prevailing wage protections and the requirements that companies have to look for American workers first. However, in recent years, many have objected that H2B workers suppress U.S. worker wages and put them out of jobs because they find loopholes and generally are able to get around the wage and employment requirements. Is this true? And is this a major problem in the H2B visa program? Or is it insignificant or no longer an issue given recent reforms and any positive wage effects of H2Bs? And then the other question on H2Bs, to add to that, is if the US were to exempt the Northern Triangle from the H2B visa cap, would the program become large enough to put downward pressure on U.S. wages? Would it benefit U.S. worker wages?
Well, I'll try to find an answer, Gord. On the first question about if there's a loophole that can be in detriment of U.S. workers, what's the first one, if I understood right, Eric? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think there's not the first of all, there's a cap for H-2B visas that is around 66,000 visas each year. That is actually pretty short if you compare with the demands that the program faces. I remember all the employers that we work with and the recruitment agencies that said we need more visas for the H-2B because we have more demands of H-2B than the one that we are being approved. So I think that it doesn't has this impact, really impact on work that Americans will need. And the people who travel, they have to also to spend their money in at least in H-2B visas for their housing, for their living there. So they are living in actually the same conditions as an American worker. So there is any benefit in that side. For the H-2A program that has to do with agriculture, they have the employer has to provide housing, but that has no cap. And what that means that if it has no cap, that means that they are not finding the workers in the US. So there is no even a need to put a limit to the workers that can go into the US territory to work for agriculture purposes. So I think I disagree with that affirmation, so to say. And in the other hand, if the people from Central America and other countries keep coming to the US, that will be affected the wages. I will leave that question to Danny, that is the economist here. But I think from my point of view, no, because they are filling job posts that are not being filled by Americans, and all of them have to comply with the minimum wages in every stage in every state. So I don't see how it could affect the wage from the U.S. workers, because it's simply because there are job posts that are not being filled. So no one is filling those positions in the U.S.
Great, thanks. Danny, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean that's always a question that it's a good one, and you know, we economists I think are to blame for, and here's a mea culpa kind of confession, right? Because I think for decades economists, when thinking about migration, they really focus in this, what I think is just one aspect of the whole migration story, which is like, our wages changing, is unemployment changing? It was very focused on labor. If you look at other kind of work of economies on other type of international flows, like trade, like investment, you see like so many other questions around them, right? Like trade and productivity, investment and innovation, investment and entrepreneurship. There's so much more, whereas in migration, we kind of stayed focused until kind of recently that there's kind of a growing, we're moving to other directions. I think the question is intuitive, like, and people, you know, it is a comment that keeps coming up on in politics, even though the evidence has shown, you know, a lot of nuances to the question. So, but just to answer, I mean, the evidence that immigrants lower wages, it's very intuitive because, you know, more supply, there's just you know, more supply of workers, you know, results in lower wages, just by looking at the very simple kind of demand and supply curve. But there's much more to it, because that demand and supply curve model, a simplistic model, thinks of all the workers being the same, right? And all the workers being substitutes to each other. Whereas in reality, the economy is much more complicated than that, because we're all kind of complementary to each other. I cannot do my work properly if you know, if I don't have a dentist. And the dentist probably cannot do his or her job properly if they don't have, there's no taxi drivers that are going to drive them there. And the taxi driver needs a cook who's going to prepare the food. And the cook needs a truck driver who's actually going to bring the food from, from the port to the place. So we're all kind of complementary in different ways. And what we see usually, what's kind of the reason behind the fact that empirically we don't find that immigrants are lowering wages is because immigrants tend to be highly complementary to local workers. And it kind of has to do with this idea that we're saying that we're not kind of taking the same jobs. And what we see in this literature, and with this I end with the boring kind of like professorship kind of spiel, is that in fact what happens and what has happened in the US, and this is a result of research by my co-author Giovanni Perry, is that immigrants help locals to experience what we call occupational upgrading. Think about the restaurant. So the fact that more people can come and maybe be at the back of the restaurant will help a lot of Americans, native born, like people who are born here, to move to the front of the restaurant, to be the host, right? And they use their skills, which is, for instance, just speaking English, in a much more efficient way for the market. Whereas, so they continue to complement each other in a way that is actually helping the locals to get better jobs and be paid more, not less. So those are kind of the dynamics that we see once we start thinking about these movements in a more nuanced way, and stepping outside from the more kind of simplistic model that help us kind of understand the dynamics, but it's missing a big part of what is actually happening.
Great. Let me try to squeeze in one more question.
Eric,
Yeah, go ahead.
if I can quickly, because it's very easy to pile on to the blind spots of economists, and having studied it myself, is that we tend to look at the benefits in the aggregate and through time. There are, at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that there are employers that abuse the system and that there are workers that lose their jobs or that get wage pressure. And if anything, we have to continue to tinker with the model if you don't get rid of things to improve it, right? And that means enforcement. And it also means something like creating an easy pass for the ethical recruiters and taking away the privilege for those that abuse the system. But the workers that actually put pressure on American workers, let's talk about the agricultural workforce, are undocumented workers, right? Because you don't know what those people are getting paid. They make up at least half of the labor force in the ag sector. So changing for legal workers, it really, in the end, does create a fairer environment for American workers.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Try to squeeze in one last question because I think it's a good one. And I'll start with you, Marcelo. It's what role could the states have in identifying sectors and communities that need seasonal workers and in monitoring compliance by employers? So just specifically to talk about the states, we've really focused on the federal government. Marcelo, if I could start with you on that.
Yeah, I really think when we think about new tools and exciting new propositions that we might want to consider, it is the potential of having cities and places be able to both apply for and integrate migrants. As you know, we have a serious issue in the U.S. around just the bifurcation of the labor market, the bifurcation of places. There's some places that are growing and others that are being left behind. So being able to really start these place-based visas, I think would be an incredible and valuable innovation that would give towns and cities and regions kind of a more active role in welcoming, integrating newcomers, and spread the benefits of immigration beyond major metropolitan areas, and really help revitalize some local economies. That it's a real threat to the American middle class and to American more shared growth, inclusive growth.
Great. Donnie or Rafael, anything you want to add? No?
I mean, I am It's a good question. I think we need, I'm biased, but we need a little bit more research on trying to quantify those needs. And it's doable. And I think the first thing when we come and say we need a comprehensive migration reform, I think we need to start, if we don't have any numbers, it's going to be really hard to think about that. So that's some of the work we're trying to do, and we'll share some updates in the future. But I think quantifying those needs it's doable at the very local level. We're trying to do it, and hopefully that's going to help us a little bit shape be constructive in this conversation.
Great.
Yes.
Rafael?
And maybe I want to add something. Now it's the market that is the one who is saying where you need workers, so you can follow that lead. But there is another problem too, that, for example, small businesses always has a problem to fill their labor needs with regular migrants, because the process is too expensive and too hard, and they need to hire some recruiter agency in the US in order to make that happen. So that will be something that will have to be studied, how to make the process so kind of easy. Marcel, I think, talk about that, how to make the process easier, so that we can see if there are small employers in the US that will need the program, and it will be available for them. And so we could see if the market shifts, and it's not only in the big, where the big employers are in ag or in hotels, or in other kind of types of business, who will demand workers from a regular migration path.
Terrific. Well, thank you to all of you. I think we could probably go on for another hour, but really thank you for a really terrific discussion, which I hope is the first of many here at the dialogue, as we seek to really find ways to maximize lawful labor pathways throughout the hemisphere. And I hope we can spend some more time evaluating the types of programs that are working, not only US, but throughout the Americas, and find a path forward, really, so that no government is leaving $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. So thank you again. Really appreciate everybody taking the time.